Rude TSA agent targets black woman, then realizes she's there to audit his job. Airports are supposed to be places of transit, gateways that connect people to distant horizons. Yet sometimes, under the fluorescent lights and the echo of rolling luggage, tensions flare and judgments emerge. Today's tale begins in the bustling concourse of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, one of the busiest airports in the world. In the midst of the swirling crowds and roaring announcements, a single encounter will spark a chain of consequences no one saw coming. A rude Transportation Security Administration (TSA) agent targets a young black woman, believing she's an easy mark for intimidation. Little does he know she's the last person he should underestimate. The day began like any other for Terrence Walker, a 30-something TSA agent who had spent the last 7 years standing at security checkpoints in Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. The midnight blue uniform and polished shoes were a familiar second skin. The robotic hum of conveyor belts and clatter of plastic trays had become the soundtrack of his daily life. Most mornings, Terrence found himself going through the motions, eyes scanning the lines, voice calling out routine instructions, posture rigid to convey the power he wielded. He thrived on a sense of authority. Though the official duty of a TSA agent is to ensure passenger safety, Terrence had discovered that he could use his position to belittle travelers if the mood struck him. If they mouthed off, he could make the inspection last longer. If they looked suspicious, often due to prejudice or ignorance, he could question them more harshly. He reveled in controlling the flow of people, relishing each exasperated sigh or fearful glance. In other words, Terrence saw no harm in enjoying what he called his domain. That morning, the lines snaked in wide arcs, with mothers juggling strollers and flight attendants trying to rush through. Business travelers clutching laptops scrolled through emails with tired eyes, while families heading for vacation wore bright colors and anxious smiles. The overhead announcements about flight statuses blended into white noise. Terrence had already been standing at his assigned station for over 2 hours, scanning IDs, barking for passengers to remove their belts and shoes, and greeting no one with an ounce of warmth. A peculiar tension hung in the air. Perhaps it was the humidity lingering from the sweltering summer in Atlanta, or maybe it was simply that travelers were more stressed than usual. For Terrence, it was an opportunity. He felt that with everyone on edge, he could ratchet up his intimidation tactics. He might catch a flustered traveler with contraband, or make someone sweat over minor infractions. Then he spotted her, a poised black woman wearing a sleek business suit, carrying a neat leather tote bag on her shoulder. She appeared calm, unaffected by the commotion around her. Terrence's first thought was that she was too calm. Her posture was almost regal, as if she owned the entire security line. In Terrence's eyes, no passenger should look so self-assured in front of him. He quickly decided she was a perfect target. She might be all style, someone who came from money and felt entitled. He disliked people who walked through security as though they were too good to be there. She was young, maybe in her late 20s or early 30s, and had the kind of understated elegance that suggested high education or a plush bank account. That was enough to trigger Terrence's usual brand of suspicion, or, more accurately, the excuse he used to justify messing with her. He noted her name on her ID, Rosalie Carter. The name struck him as both delicate and commanding. In fact, when he read it aloud and compared it to her photograph, Terrence found himself momentarily disarmed by her quiet confidence. Determined to reassert his control, he gestured sharply for Rosalie to step aside after she placed her items on the conveyor belt. "Ma'am, I'm going to need a further inspection," he said stiffly, his tone one that offered no explanation, just an order. Rosalie arched an eyebrow, but remained composed. "Is there a problem, officer?" Terence didn't answer directly. He simply pointed to the area near the body scanner, making it clear she should stand aside while others continued to pass. What Terence couldn't have guessed at that moment was that Rosalie Carter was not just another passenger. She was someone who walked into that airport for a very specific reason, one that would shake Terence to his core. He simply hadn't realized it yet. Rosalie Carter was no ordinary traveler. She had boarded countless flights in her life, visited dozens of airports, and gained an insider's view of security measures that would stun most frequent flyers. Yet her official role remained shrouded in confidentiality. In addition to being a seasoned consultant specializing in organizational compliance, she served in a specialized capacity for the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, as a secret shopper and auditor. Her mission was simple on paper: to assess TSA agents in real, unannounced scenarios, then compile a detailed report on how these professionals conducted themselves in everyday interactions. Few individuals knew the intricacies of her true job description. Even fewer recognized that her critiques could shape policy changes, influence staffing decisions, and even lead to terminations or promotions. On this particular day, Rosalie had been assigned to evaluate the TSA staff at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, specifically those with repeated complaints or patterns of questionable behavior. She had studied the complaint logs, the internal files, and the roster of agents on duty. Her target was Terence Walker. Federal oversight bodies, including the DHS, had received multiple grievances about Terence's hostile behavior, his tendency to single out certain passengers, and his habit of detaining them under vague pretenses. Instead of firing him outright, management, under pressure to handle the matter discreetly, had arranged for a covert review of Terence's on-the-job conduct. After thoroughly briefing Rosalie on the details, they entrusted her with the task of evaluating whether Terence was salvageable as an employee or deserved immediate termination. From the moment Terence singled her out for further inspection, Rosalie's instincts went on high alert. She had an arsenal of knowledge at her disposal: the Passenger's Bill of Rights, TSA guidelines, and the standard protocols for random inspections. Nothing about Terence's approach felt standard. He hadn't chosen her randomly. He had singled her out with a predatory glare that sent red flags flying. Maintaining her composure, Rosalie followed the directive, stepping to the side without complaint. If Terence wanted to escalate this encounter, she needed to see exactly how far he'd go. Terence motioned another TSA agent over, a young woman named Beth, who looked uneasy the moment she arrived. Beth had heard rumors of Terence's style. She recognized Rosalie's poised demeanor might mean trouble if Terence overstepped. As Rosalie waited, Beth half whispered to Terence, "Is this a random inspection?" He responded with a curt nod that didn't quite match the question. Then, in a brusque tone, he said, "Monsieur AM, are you carrying any liquids or gels exceeding the permissible limit?" Rosalie calmly pointed to the tray, carrying her small bag of toiletries, well under the limit. She'd meticulously followed every rule, not only because she was a seasoned traveler, but because she was testing Terence's reaction. "Everything is within regulations," she said smoothly. Terence pretended to scan her bag's contents more thoroughly on the X-ray monitor. "I see something suspicious," he muttered, although Rosalie knew full well there was nothing suspicious in her bag. She watched as Terence signaled for a manual search. Beth began to reach for the bag, but Terence shoved her aside politely, taking the lead himself. He rifled through Rosalie's neatly packed items. His fingers lingered on trivial objects: an eyeglass cloth, a lipstick case, a small notebook. The entire time, he kept glancing at Rosalie, as though waiting for her to crack under pressure. But Rosalie knew how to play the game. Her face remained an unreadable mask. Meanwhile, the line began to back up. Other travelers cast nervous glances in their direction. A supervisor, several stations away, peered in Terrence's direction, noticing the growing delay, but he was momentarily swamped by a separate issue with a broken scanner. Terrence seemed to relish the power of holding everyone up, making Rosalie stand there as though she was guilty of something. Minutes dragged on. Beth, now anxious, tried to intervene, suggesting that they didn't need to hold up the entire checkpoint. Terrence ignored her. He carried on, even asking Rosalie to remove her shoes and jacket a second time, an odd request since the body scanner had cleared her. Rosalie told herself to remain patient. She was there to do a job, to document everything. Still, each passing second intensified the tension. She considered how best to note Terrence's unprofessional tactics, the intimidation in his voice, and the baseless nature of the suspicion. A single misstep on her part could reveal her true identity, so she kept her composure, though her heart was pounding with a mix of frustration and determination. By the time Terrence finally handed her belongings back, he had taken nearly 15 minutes of her time. That might seem minor to some, but in an airport security line, it was excessive enough to raise eyebrows, especially since Terrence had no legitimate cause. Rosalie nodded politely, returning her items to her tote bag. She glanced at Terrence. He wore a smug grin, as though he'd proven a point. Little did he know, he'd just provided Rosalie with more than enough evidence to launch a damning review. The stage was set for a confrontation that would soon spiral well beyond Terrence's control. Rosalie spent the next hour in the airport terminal, retrieving her phone, checking emails, and updating her notes. She painstakingly recorded each detail of her interaction with Terrence. The department had trained her thoroughly. Note the specific language used, gauge the tone of voice, observe how other TSA staff react, and most importantly, document any racial bias or targeted harassment. Terrence's performance had struck every red flag. Still, she needed more data. A single encounter, while telling, might not suffice for an official report recommending severe disciplinary measures. She had to observe Terrence in other contexts, see if he targeted other passengers of color, how he handled those in wheelchairs, or how he behaved with families, seniors, or foreign travelers. Her job wasn't just to catch him in one misdeed, it was to see if he had a chronic pattern that threatened the integrity of airport security and the well-being of passengers. Observing him discreetly required cunning. Rosalie booked a ticket on a flight set to depart in a few hours, but it was simply a placeholder. She had no intention of actually leaving Atlanta that day. Hartsfield-Jackson's sprawling concourses provided ample cover for her to navigate around, watching Terrence from a distance. Terrence, for his part, was busy continuing his shift. By mid-morning, the lines swelled with a new wave of passengers. Rosalie took up a position where she could see him clearly. She pretended to wait at a nearby gate, flipping through a magazine, but her eyes remained fixed on the checkpoint. Within the span of 20 minutes, she witnessed him step up his intimidation with a Middle Eastern man wearing traditional attire. Terrence ordered him to remove his belt, shoes, and jacket, even though the man had passed through the scanner without issue. The man complied, visibly uncomfortable. Moments later, Terrence delayed a Latina mother traveling with 2 small children, demanding extra screening on her diaper bag. Again, the body scanner had flagged nothing. Rosalie watched as Terrence pointed to random shapes on the X-ray monitor, claiming they needed further inspection. The woman apologized repeatedly, flustered by the unexpected scrutiny. Her children began to cry from the stress. Each incident solidified Rosalie's impression. Terrence thrived on picking out individuals he believed were least likely to fight back. People of color, people who didn't speak fluent English, anyone who seemed unsure or vulnerable, these were his prime targets. Over and over, the pattern repeated. Rosalie remained calm, though her frustration simmered beneath the surface. She knew that incompetent or biased TSA agents tarnished the mission of ensuring safety. They sowed distrust, inflicted emotional harm, and wasted time and resources. This was precisely why secret audits existed, to catch those who abused their power. At one point, Rosalie watched Terence exchange a smug grin with another agent as he patted down a confused elderly passenger. She could almost hear the old man's trembling voice echo in her mind. "Is there a problem, sir?" "I have a pacemaker." Terence dismissed him curtly, ignoring the man's anxiety. Rosalie jotted down every detail. She felt a surge of righteous indignation. All the while, Terence remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing behind her steady gaze. Late that morning, Rosalie decided she had enough initial evidence to proceed with the next phase, making her presence known to a supervisor. She planned to request a private conversation with the TSA manager on duty, someone with enough authority to effect immediate changes if necessary. She would reveal her credentials, show the documentation, and share recorded audio if required. However, as she gathered her notes, an unexpected development occurred. Terence, on a quick break, strode casually over to a nearby coffee kiosk. He was alone, separated from the watchful eyes of his fellow agents. Rosalie felt a sudden compulsion to confront him, not in anger, but as a subtle warning that the eyes of accountability were upon him. Yet she hesitated. The protocol for covert audits typically insisted on contacting a supervisor first to maintain the integrity of the process. But fate had other plans. Terence caught sight of her from across the corridor. A flicker of recognition passed over his face. He must have recalled that this was the arrogant passenger he had singled out earlier. Something within Terence, perhaps a curiosity or an ego-driven desire for a showdown, propelled him to approach her. This chance encounter would spark a more direct confrontation, one in which Terence would begin to sense he was playing a game with stakes far higher than he ever imagined. "What are you still doing here?" Terence asked, his voice mixing confusion with a tinge of annoyance. He tried to keep his tone casual, but it was evident he recognized Rosalie from their earlier encounter. He took a sip of his coffee, a steaming latte, judging by the aroma that wafted between them. Rosalie looked up from her phone, feigning mild surprise. "I have a later flight," she replied evenly, not giving away any emotion. She paused, considering how best to handle this confrontation. Normally, her protocol demanded minimal interaction unless absolutely necessary. But Terence was here now, and perhaps this was an opportunity to glean more insight into his mindset. Terence narrowed his eyes. "Oh, heading somewhere important, I bet?" There was a sneer in his voice, as if he found the notion of Rosalie being important to be laughable. He cast a quick glance around, noting that no one from TSA was within earshot. "Make sure you arrive at the gate extra early. Wouldn't want to hold up the line again." Rosalie's internal sense of calm wavered ever so slightly. She felt a spike of indignation at his tone, but reminded herself this was exactly the type of behavior she was sent to document. "I'll be sure to keep that in mind," she said, offering no direct challenge. No subtle compliance either. She wanted him to keep talking, to see if he would reveal just how deep his prejudice and intimidation tactics ran. Terence took another sip of coffee and scoffed. "You look like the type who thinks the rules don't apply. Let's just say I've been around plenty of people who walk in here thinking they're above security." He paused, his eyes flicking to Rosalie's suit, then her tote bag, as if searching for a reason to belittle her. "You fit the profile." Rosalie bristled at the phrase, "fit the profile." She pressed her lips together, fighting the urge to respond with righteous fury. She recalled the earlier incidents of him targeting other passengers of color. Now, the situation was personal. "It's unfortunate you see it that way," Rosalie managed, carefully measuring her words. "Everyone goes through the same scanners, the same checks." "Right," Terence responded sarcastically, setting his coffee down on a nearby high-top table. "We do our jobs to keep everyone safe. But let's face it, some people attract more attention than others." He was either incredibly brazen or hopelessly clueless. Rosalie couldn't decide which, possibly both. She had confronted many complacent or arrogant employees in her line of work, but Terence's confidence stood out. He believed himself untouchable, so certain that no one would ever question his authority, let alone punish him for abuses of power. Wanting to see if he would incriminate himself further, Rosalie said carefully, "It's a big responsibility, deciding who gets flagged." Terence chuckled dark, condescending. "Yeah, well, we see what's out there. If you knew the half of it, you wouldn't judge me. People try to sneak in contraband all the time." Of course, Rosalie agreed, the threats are real. He nodded, warming to the conversation as though she'd just validated his worldview. "Exactly. So let me do my job. If I see someone suspicious, I handle it. Simple as that." Rosalie forced a neutral smile. "I'm sure management appreciates your diligence." Terence shrugged as though shrugging off praise, but his eyes glowed with self-satisfaction. Management is all about paperwork and politics. Half of them have never manned a checkpoint in their lives. The irony, Rosalie noted, was that he spoke with disdain about the very people who oversaw him and had the power to remove him. As their conversation lingered in this tense air, Rosalie wondered if she should maintain her cover or reveal her affiliation. She decided it was not yet time. A more formal approach was needed to ensure her investigation remained valid. Just then, the overhead speakers announced the boarding process for a flight to Chicago. People bustled around them, rolling suitcases and verifying seat assignments. Terence glanced at the crowd, then back at Rosalie. "Guess I should get back to it. Just remember what I said. Rules apply to everyone." His lips curled in a half smirk. Rosalie nodded, doing her best not to show the flood of feelings rising within her. "I'll remember." He turned on his heel, strutted away, coffee in hand. For a moment, Rosalie just stood there, watching him go. She felt a twinge of anger and an even stronger surge of resolve. If Terence thought he could continue abusing his position unchecked, he was in for a rude awakening. She was determined to handle this by the book, ensuring that every iota of evidence was properly catalogued so the final report would be irrefutable. As Terence melted back into the sea of TSA uniforms, Rosalie glanced at the time. She would schedule her meeting with the on-site TSA manager within the hour, present her credentials, and request immediate observation of Terence's methods. Most likely, Terence would be unaware that his every move was about to be evaluated by not just one person, but an entire chain of command. Yet, as she moved through the concourse toward a quieter administrative hallway, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Terence had eyes and ears of his own friends or colleagues who might tip him off to her presence. She had to be cautious. If Terence suspected a formal audit, he might alter his behavior or worse, lash out in unpredictable ways. Little did she know that Terence, now suspicious, was indeed beginning to suspect something was amiss. In just a short while, their paths would collide again, and this time, the fallout would escalate with dramatic consequences. Rosalie navigated the winding corridors behind the main terminal, following signs that read "Authorized personnel only." As part of her covert role, she carried special credentials that would grant her temporary access to administrative areas. She rapped on the door labeled TSA Administration and was greeted by a security officer who quickly checked her ID. Inside, the office hummed with the quiet intensity of government operations. Phones rang softly, printers whirred, and men and women in suits or TSA uniforms walked briskly between cubicles. Rosalie asked for the manager on duty, a seasoned TSA official named Mark Lydell. Within minutes, a tall man in his early 50s appeared, wearing a crisp uniform and an air of polite efficiency. "Miss Carter," he said, extending a hand, "let's speak in my office." They settled into a small, no-frills room furnished with a desk, 2 chairs, and a file cabinet. As Rosalie placed her tote on the floor, Mark closed the door. "I've been expecting you," he said, keeping his voice low. "We got the memo this morning from DHS that an auditor would be on site. They didn't say who, but I suspected it might be you." Rosalie handed over the papers identifying her as a DHS-sanctioned auditor, detailing her authority to conduct surprise inspections of TSA employees. Mark scanned them, nodding occasionally. He set them down, folded his hands on the desk, and looked at her with mild concern. "What have you found so far?" She recounted her experiences since arriving, emphasizing Terence Walker's behavior. She spoke of his intimidation tactics, the unnecessary secondary inspections, and the pattern of targeting vulnerable or minority travelers. Mark's expression darkened with each detail. "We've had complaints about him," he admitted, "but each time he's managed to dodge formal disciplinary action. Management is short-staffed, and we're dealing with so many other issues. Sometimes these things slip through. But that's no excuse." "Precisely," Rosalie said. "My recommendation will carry weight. I need to see if this behavior is correctable or if removal is necessary. I'd like to observe him again, but this time I'd prefer a vantage point where I can watch his entire process. Maybe through your surveillance system, and I need your cooperation in letting him operate without a heads up." Mark nodded slowly. "That can be arranged." He rubbed a hand over his chin, as though contemplating the potential fallout. "What about a direct confrontation? Are you planning on interviewing him?" "I will eventually," Rosalie replied. "But I'd like to gather as much unfiltered data first. Once he knows he's under review, his behavior could change. And if he's truly unfit, it'll show." Mark opened a drawer, pulled out a ring of keys, and jotted down a series of access codes. "I'll grant you access to our observation room. We have multiple camera angles on each checkpoint. You can watch Terence without him knowing, and if needed, we can intervene at any point." Rosalie accepted the codes, feeling a surge of appreciation for Mark's straightforward cooperation. "Thank you. I'll do my best to be discreet." Before she left, Mark cleared his throat. "Miss Carter, I know we're dealing with a potential problem employee here, but I'd like you to keep in mind that we also have good agents who might be impacted by any blowback. Terence is, well, he's polarizing. Some of the staff side with him, some are fed up with him." Rosalie's gaze flickered with understanding. "I'll be fair," she assured him. "If the problem is a single individual, I'll make that clear. If it's systemic, I won't shy away from stating it. The truth is the best way to maintain public trust." Mark managed a tight smile. "Agreed. Let's hope we can resolve this swiftly." With that, Rosalie left his office, feeling the weight of her mission even more acutely. The next few hours promised to be crucial. She had Terence's confession about profiles, his pattern of harassment, and an entire wave of passengers possibly about to flow through the checkpoint in the busy midday rush. If Terence's behavior continued unabated, it would only strengthen her case. Finding the observation room wasn't difficult. Mark's directions led her to a small chamber with a row of screens flickering in real time, feeds of the security lines. Each camera was angled to capture a different perspective. Overhead shots of the conveyor belts, close-ups of the ID check station, wide shots of the waiting lines. Rosalie settled into a chair, scanning the monitors until she found Terence, posted in the same spot he'd been in all morning. She watched as he engaged with a series of passengers. Some interactions seemed routine. He scanned IDs, motioned people through, but every so often his body language shifted, his posture growing rigid when a certain passenger approached. He would pull them aside for extra screening or question them more aggressively. Consistent with her earlier observations, those singled out typically belonged to some minority demographic or wore attire that Terence deemed suspicious. An hour passed, then two. Rosalie amassed a wealth of notes, timestamps, descriptions of each targeted individual, Terence's gestures, and the reactions of his colleagues. She zoomed in on Beth, the younger agent who'd assisted him before. Beth looked conflicted, occasionally shooting Terence a look that bordered on disapproval. Yet she never openly challenged him. By midday, Rosalie felt confident she'd gathered more than enough damning information. Yet she also understood that the wheels of government bureaucracy turned slowly. She needed to confront Terence in a formal setting, with management present to ensure due process. As she prepared to exit the observation room, her phone buzzed. Mark Lydell's caller ID flashed. "Miss Carter," he said when she picked up, his tone urgent. "I think you should come to the main lobby near the checkpoint. We've got a situation involving Terence and an irate passenger. It's escalating fast." Rosalie hurried out the door, heart pounding. For all her composure, she couldn't quell the sudden surge of apprehension. What was Terence up to now? And how badly might this end for the unsuspecting passenger at the center of his wrath? Whatever was unfolding, it might just be the final straw and the turning point that brought Terence Walker face to face with his looming fate. The moment Rosalie stepped out of the administrative corridor and into the main terminal, she sensed the tension in the air. Travelers crowded around a scene unfolding near the security checkpoint. Raised voices cut through the general hum of airport activity. Cell phones were out, passengers recording whatever drama was transpiring. Rosalie wove through the onlookers until she reached a cluster of TSA agents forming a loose circle. In the middle stood Terence, red-faced and livid, and a middle-aged black woman who looked as though she was on the verge of tears. Standing protectively beside the woman was an older man, her husband, presumably shouting something about rights and discrimination. "I'm telling you, we've done nothing wrong," the husband bellowed, anger mingling with desperation in his voice. The woman clutched her bag, shaking her head in disbelief. Terence towered over them, arms crossed. "I need you two to calm down and comply with our search. This is a security matter." "Security matter?" the woman echoed, voice trembling. "You singled me out for no reason. I emptied my pockets, took off my jewelry, and you still demanded more." Terence's jaw tightened. "You set off the alarm. You're wearing suspicious clothing." "That's a headscarf," the husband cut in. "Suspicious clothing? Are you even hearing yourself?" Rosalie's heart panged as she recognized the patterns she'd documented. Here it was, unfolding in real time, in front of a whole crowd. This might be the breaking point. She spotted Mark Lydell at the periphery, observing with a grim expression, ready to step in but perhaps waiting for Rosalie's signal. Sensing it was time to de-escalate before things got out of hand, Rosalie stepped forward, weaving past the circle of onlookers. She approached Terence calmly, speaking loudly enough for him to hear her, but softly enough not to escalate the chaos. "Officer Walker, is there a problem here?" Terence spun around, momentarily startled by her presence. His eyes flickered with confusion. Perhaps he remembered their earlier conversation and was now wondering why she was intervening. "Ma'am, I need you to step back. This doesn't concern you." "Actually, it does," Rosalie said, pulling out her DHS identification, flipping it open just enough for Terence and the other TSA agents to see. A hush fell over those who noticed the official seal. "I'm an auditor with the Department of Homeland Security. I'm requesting you lower your voice and explain what's happening here." For a split second, Terence froze. The color drained from his face. Whispers broke out among the TSA agents. Mark Lydell took a step closer, prepared to support Rosalie if needed. The couple, noticing the shift, looked at Rosalie with a mix of hope and confusion. Terence stammered, trying to maintain a semblance of authority. I was just doing my job." This woman refused to remove her headscarf. It set off the scanner. The woman shook her head vigorously. "That's a lie." The scanner was clear. "I only refuse to remove my scarf because it's part of my religious attire. TSA rules say I can have a private pat down if needed," the crowd murmured. Rosalie nodded, addressing Terence in a measured tone. Is this true? TSA guidelines allow passengers with certain religious clothing to request a private screening. Did you inform her of that option? Terence's eyes flickered with the panic of someone caught off guard. She was being uncooperative. The lines are already too long. Officer Walker, Rosalie cut in, her voice firm but calm. The guidelines are clear. If she asked for a private screening or a pat down by a female officer, that should have been accommodated. Is that correct? Before Terence could respond, Mark Lydell stepped forward, voice steady. Yes, that is correct. We always offer that option. This escalated unnecessarily. Terence's mouth opened and closed as he fumbled for a defense. But the crowd's gaze was already condemning him. The woman's husband glared, and the woman stood trembling, tears brimming in her eyes. Another TSA agent quietly guided them aside, reassuring them that the situation would be handled properly. They were offered an apology and ushered toward a private area for the appropriate screening. Meanwhile, Terence faced a new dilemma. Rosalie Carter, who only hours ago seemed like a random passenger he could intimidate. Now she was revealing herself as a DHS auditor, carrying far more authority than he ever imagined. The onlookers, sensing the shift in power, began dispersing, though a few lingered with their phones still recording. Rosalie fixed her gaze on Terence. Officer Walker, I'd like a word in private. He swallowed hard, nodding numbly. Mark took the initiative, guiding them both toward a quiet corner by the checkpoint. Once they were out of earshot of the general public, Rosalie softened her tone, but only slightly. I'm not just here as a passenger. I've been auditing your performance today. Your behavior has been unprofessional, discriminatory, and in direct violation of TSA protocols. Terence started to sweat, his carefully maintained persona crumbling. He glanced at Mark, who nodded solemnly, as if confirming the dire nature of the situation. I didn't know, Terence stammered. Rosalie took a deep breath. She had to remain objective, despite her personal outrage. I have documented instances of targeting and harassment. Passengers have complained repeatedly. The footage corroborates what we saw today. This is no longer just a misunderstanding, Officer Walker. This is a serious breach of federal guidelines. Mark gently laid a hand on Terence's shoulder, not in sympathy, but in a signal of finality. Terence, I'll have to place you on immediate administrative leave, pending an official investigation. All the arrogance and bravado that Terence had displayed earlier was gone. He looked defeated, as if someone had pulled the rug from under his feet. But I was just trying to keep us safe. Rosalie's gaze hardened. Safety doesn't require violating people's rights or using racial profiling. That's not how the TSA is meant to operate. With that, Mark quietly told Terence to hand over his badge and accompany him to the administration office. Terence complied, his hands trembling slightly. As they left, Rosalie felt a wave of relief and something else, a profound sadness. She had performed her duty, ensuring accountability, but it came with the realization that someone's life and career had just taken a sharp downward turn. Little did they all know, this was only the beginning of the fallout that would unfold from Terence Walker's choices. The airport rumor mill would soon ignite, media might catch wind of the fiasco, and Terence would be forced to confront the consequences of his actions in ways he never thought possible. Karma, it seemed, had arrived in the form of a poised black woman on a secret mission, and it was only just getting started. The TSA administration office was abuzz with tension. Terence sat in a plain metal chair, head lowered, hands clenched in his lap. Across from him, Rosalie and Mark stood quietly by a desk, reviewing the paperwork that would finalize Terence's immediate leave of absence. A hush had fallen over the space, as though everyone present understood the gravity of what was happening. Terence risked a glance upward, scanning the faces in the room. His gaze flickered to Rosalie, who maintained a reserved demeanor. Once, he would have glared at her with contempt. Now, his expression was tinged with disbelief and regret. Mark cleared his throat. "Officer Walker, you understand that this action, placing you on administrative leave, isn't a final determination of guilt. There will be a formal investigation, during which you have the right to respond to any allegations. However, effective immediately, you will relinquish your duties until further notice." Terence nodded almost imperceptibly. His voice, when he found it, was subdued. I understand." Rosalie stood silent. By protocol, she had no obligation to speak with Terence any further. Her part was mostly done. She would compile her final report, submit her findings, and wait for DHS to take the appropriate actions. But something compelled her to step forward. Maybe she felt a sliver of empathy, or perhaps she wanted to see if Terence had any remorse beyond self-pity. She offered a small, measured nod in his direction. "There's an avenue for accountability," she said, her voice a balance of firmness and clarity. "The investigation will look at your entire record, your training, and your conduct. If there's any mitigating factor, it'll be noted." Terence's lips parted as if he wanted to speak. His eyes brimmed with a swirl of emotions, anger, confusion, perhaps even fear. Finally, he managed. "I thought I was doing the right thing, guarding against threats." Rosalie's expression softened. "No one faults you for being vigilant, but vigilance has to align with policy, training, and respect for passengers' rights. Racial profiling isn't vigilance, it's discriminatory, and the harassment you inflicted, it's unacceptable." He rubbed his forehead, likely remembering the many times he'd singled out travelers who didn't deserve his suspicion. "I guess I never thought about it that way," he murmured. I was just following instincts." Rosalie inhaled slowly, controlling her own frustration. "Instincts are fine, as long as they're informed by professionalism and fairness. Yours were fueled by bias and power trips. That's the problem." A flicker of defiance sparked in Terence's eyes. "Easy for you to say. You don't know what it's like on the front lines. We see all kinds of people, and we have to make split-second calls." Mark stepped in, voice calm. "That doesn't excuse the pattern we've witnessed. This is bigger than a split-second call. There are multiple complaints. Documented. You went beyond standard protocol, repeatedly." Silence enveloped them again, heavy as a storm cloud. At last, Terence let out a long sigh. "So what happens now?" Rosalie lifted her chin. "I'll finalize my report. You'll be notified of any findings or recommended actions. If the investigation concludes you violated regulations, you could face penalties ranging from mandatory retraining to termination, possibly even legal action if any civil rights were violated in a severe way." She paused. "I do believe in second chances, but that depends on whether you're willing to own up to your mistakes." Terence swallowed hard. For a moment, it looked as though tears threatened behind his eyes, but he blinked them away. "I don't know what to say." "Then say nothing," Mark suggested gently. "Go home, reflect, cooperate with the investigation. That's all you can do right now." Standing near the doorway, Beth, the younger TSA agent who'd occasionally assisted Terence, looked on with somber eyes. As Terence passed her on his way out, she said softly, "I'm sorry it came to this." He gave a shallow nod, too ashamed or overwhelmed to reply. With that, he exited the office, turning one last time as if to speak, but the words never found him. The door closed, leaving only Rosalie, Mark, and the tension that had pervaded every corner of that small administrative space. Rosalie exhaled, tension loosening in her shoulders. She had carried out her responsibilities, but the emotional toll was undeniable. Mark, observing her expression, offered a supportive nod. "You did your job well, Miss Carter. This was overdue." She mustered a tired smile. Thank you. It's not always easy, but it's necessary. She glanced at the door. Now the real work begins documenting everything, so that if anyone tries to downplay or dismiss this, the facts will speak for themselves. Mark agreed. I'll make sure you have access to all relevant records. The rest is up to DHS. Rosalie gathered her things, preparing to leave. Although Terence's immediate threat to passengers was neutralized, she knew the ramifications would continue. Perhaps there would be media attention, maybe internal pushback from staff who sympathized with Terence. Some might paint him as a scapegoat, others would hail his downfall as justice served. One thing was certain: Terence's illusions of invincibility had been shattered. The karmic hammer had fallen, and all the damage he had inflicted with his prejudice was now coming back to him full force. Through it all, Rosalie remained resolute, her commitment unwavering to ensuring that, in America's busiest airport, every passenger, black, brown, or otherwise, would be treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. In the days that followed, the story of Terence's confrontation spread through the airport grapevine like wildfire. TSA employees exchanged knowing looks. Some shrugged, saying they saw it coming. Others expressed disbelief, defending Terence's tough stance on security. A few expressed relief that someone had finally intervened. And for those travelers who had witnessed the dramatic scene at the security checkpoint, the memory lingered. Rosalie, meanwhile, found herself poring over her observations in a sterile conference room that the TSA had provided for her temporary use. She spent hours compiling video footage, scanning complaint logs, and transcribing every note she had taken. Each time she revisited the encounter with Terence, she found herself both angry and resolute. Anger at how someone in a position of authority could willfully misuse their power, and resolute in her mission to ensure that the system corrected this grave flaw. Her final report ran to over 50 pages, detailing incidents of blatant racial profiling, emotional distress inflicted on passengers, and repeated protocol violations. She included screenshots from surveillance footage, quotes from bystander statements, and references to TSA guidelines that Terence had clearly disregarded. The document left little room for doubt about his culpability. Around the same time, local news stations picked up a short clip of Terence's altercation with the woman in the headscarf. Someone had posted their cell phone recording on social media. It didn't take long for the incident to go viral. Hashtags condemning racial profiling at airports popped up on various platforms. Outrage poured in from civil rights organizations demanding an immediate overhaul of TSA practices. To manage the mounting pressure, the TSA released a brief statement confirming that an officer had been placed on leave pending an investigation into misconduct. They did not name Terence publicly, but those in the airport community already knew who it was. Within a day, reporters began calling the airport, hoping to speak with witnesses or glean more information. Some approached Rosalie, but she politely declined, citing ongoing administrative procedures. Privately, Rosalie thought about the ramifications for Terence. She had discovered that he lived alone in a modest apartment on the outskirts of Atlanta, had no spouse or children, and mostly kept to himself. Some colleagues described him as a dedicated worker, others called him aggressive. Now, with his livelihood hanging by a thread, she wondered if he was grappling with remorse, or if he was bitterly clinging to his old justifications. 3 days after their last encounter, Rosalie received an email from Terence. The subject line read, "Personal reflection." She hesitated before opening it. Strictly speaking, it was against her usual protocol to engage directly with an individual under investigation, but curiosity and a sense of fairness pushed her to click. The email was surprisingly contrite. Terence admitted that he might have allowed personal biases to color his decisions. He apologized to Rosalie for the way he had treated her, acknowledging that he had no right to single her out. The tone suggested a man realizing that he stood on the brink of losing everything. Rosalie read the message carefully, then closed her laptop, heart heavy. She had witnessed apologies before, some sincere, some self-serving. She couldn't yet gauge Terence's motives, but she did consider the possibility of redemption. People were capable of change if they chose to confront the roots of their prejudice. That same afternoon, she had a final debrief with Mark Lydell. They sat in his office, the door closed to shut out the bustle of the corridor. "Your report is thorough," he said, flipping through the pages. "It gives us no option but to recommend termination." Rosalie nodded. "Based on the evidence, it's the appropriate measure. But let me ask, does TSA offer any rehabilitative program for employees with potential for improvement?" Mark sighed. "We do have mandatory retraining sessions, sensitivity workshops, and oversight for those who show genuine remorse. But Terence's track record is lengthy. It's not just a single incident, it's a pattern. Upper management might decide it's too big a risk to keep him on." Rosalie ran a hand through her hair. Part of her believed strongly in accountability. Another part recognized that mistakes, no matter how grievous, could sometimes be atoned for. But she also remembered the tearful faces of those passengers Terence had harassed. Their rights mattered more than Terence's comfort. In the end, Rosalie decided not to respond to Terence's email just yet. The formal investigation would proceed, and Terence would have ample opportunity to present his case, to apologize, and to demonstrate whether he truly grasped the seriousness of his actions. Meanwhile, Rosalie's role was nearly complete. She left the conference room that evening, stepping into the waning sunlight that filtered through the large glass windows of the airport's atrium. She heard the hum of travelers rushing to flights, the rolling of suitcases, the gentle reminders of gate agents overhead. And despite the stress and drama of the past few days, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. She had done her part to safeguard the dignity of passengers who too often went unheard or unprotected. Soon, she would head back to her home office in Washington, D.C., her job here complete. Yet the story would continue to ripple through the corridors of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, forever altering how one TSA agent, once confident of his untouchable status, would answer for his actions. Karma had indeed arrived, and it had done so swiftly, carrying the unmistakable weight of justice. 1 week after the confrontation at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, Rosalie Carter returned to her usual duties in Washington, D.C. She carefully compiled every note, video clip, and traveler statement into a comprehensive report that spanned dozens of pages. The document laid bare the misconduct of TSA officer Terence Walker, revealing a pattern of racial profiling, unnecessary detentions, and blatant disregard for federal screening protocols. Although her assignment in Atlanta was technically complete, Rosalie found it difficult to shake thoughts of how Terence's actions had threatened so many travelers' peace of mind. Rosalie's report became the cornerstone of a formal investigation. As evidence poured in from security camera footage to passenger complaints, TSA officials faced mounting pressure. Local news stations began to circulate cell phone videos from bystanders who had recorded Terence targeting a woman wearing a headscarf. Social media erupted with civil rights organizations demanding accountability. The once routine hum of airport security suddenly found itself under a microscope. Meanwhile, Terence awaited his hearing. Seated before TSA's internal affairs representatives, he listened as each allegation was presented in painstaking detail. Video clips showed him singling out travelers who had set off no alarms. Passenger testimony described humiliating searches and fear-based interrogations. There was no denying the data. Terence had disproportionately targeted people of color, foreign nationals, and those who wore religious attire. Initially, he tried to defend himself. He insisted he was acting out of caution, citing the constant threat of potential attacks. But as investigators outlined how a proper security check should proceed respecting both protocol and passengers' civil rights, Terence's justifications unraveled. In the end, he grew silent. The hearing room was tense, with Terence appearing to realize how severely he had overstepped. Rosalie received updates from the TSA manager, Mark Lydell, who confirmed that the evidence left them little choice but to terminate Terence. Still, the agency offered an alternative path if Terence agreed to attend a rigorous bias training and conflict resolution program, accept a demotion, and work under strict oversight. He could have a slim chance at re-employment in a more limited capacity. After prolonged deliberation, Terence agreed anything to avoid being cast entirely adrift. Shortly after, Rosalie settled into a new assignment in a different city. Although her role required her to move on, she still reflected on the extent of Terence's damage. She thought of the anxious faces of travelers who had borne the brunt of his intimidation, as well as the tears of frustration and fear she had witnessed firsthand. Yet she also recalled Terence's final moments of realization when his bravado crumbled beneath the weight of undeniable proof. People could indeed change, but true repentance would require steady work. A few weeks passed. One afternoon, Rosalie checked her inbox to find an unexpected email from Terence, titled, "Thank you." She paused before opening it, aware that her official report had likely sealed his fate. Curious and somewhat apprehensive, she began to read. The tone of Terence's words surprised her. He apologized unreservedly for his actions, admitting that he had come to recognize his deep-seated biases. He wrote that losing his position had been a rude awakening, forcing him to confront the pain he had caused. Though he didn't expect forgiveness, he wanted Rosalie to know that her intervention had jolted him out of a dangerous mindset. Rosalie stared at the screen, remembering how defiant Terence had been the day she met him. Now, his email revealed genuine remorse, a willingness to change. People rarely made such a dramatic turnaround overnight, but the accountability he now faced seemed to be sparking a sincere re-evaluation of his beliefs. For a few moments, Rosalie wrestled with how to respond. Ultimately, she composed a brief reply acknowledging his apology, encouraging him to remain committed to the training and introspection required for real transformation. By the time another month had passed, Mark sent her a concise follow-up. Terence had been officially dismissed as a frontline TSA agent, with no chance of returning to the same role. However, he had already begun the rehabilitative program, attended mandatory workshops, and was showing signs of genuine progress. While some in management advocated for a permanent ban, a small faction believed redemption was possible. Perhaps, in a new capacity far from direct passenger interaction, he might someday serve the TSA without repeating his past mistakes. Within Hartsfield-Jackson, changes were evident. Mandatory sensitivity training rolled out for all staff. Complaint logs were scrutinized more aggressively, and managers encouraged employees to report instances of improper conduct. Agents like Beth, who had quietly disapproved of Terence's tactics, felt emboldened to speak up. While the airport's daily grind continued, a subtle shift took place in the way travelers were treated, one sparked by Terence's downfall, but embraced by those determined to prevent similar abuses. Rosalie, for her part, felt reassured that her work had lasting impact. She had seen firsthand how prejudice, left unchecked, could erode the very mission of security. Yet she had also witnessed how accountability and structured consequences might prompt real change. Every new airport she audited reminded her that beneath the layers of regulations and protocols lay a fundamental duty to treat each traveler with respect. Months later, an automated message from Terence arrived in her inbox. He was still attending his workshops, he wrote, still learning what it meant to respect others' dignity. and still trying to rebuild a career in a more supportive, less harmful manner. Rosalie read it and closed her laptop with a quiet sense of closure. For so many, Terence's story would remain a tale of well-deserved comeuppance. For Rosalie, it was also a lesson in the sometimes hard, sometimes hopeful road toward redemption, and a reaffirmation that no matter how swift or slow, justice has a way of finding its mark. In the end, Terence Walker's misguided reign at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport came to a crashing halt, thanks to the quiet resolve of Rosalie Carter. When he targeted her, unaware of her true mission, he set in motion the unraveling of his own misconduct. Rosalie's investigation not only exposed a pattern of harassment and bias, but also forced the TSA to improve its oversight and training. Hard karma caught up to Terence, yet from the ashes of his downfall sprouted the seed of genuine remorse and the possibility of a new beginning. Now, I want to hear from you. If this story struck a chord, please remember to like the video and share it with friends who believe in justice and fairness. And if you want more stories that celebrate truth, transformation, and the quiet heroes among us, be sure to subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us bring more real and riveting tales to light.